My name is Doug Millard. I am the Curator of Space Technology at the Science Museum in London. The Science Museum Space Gallery has all sorts of wonderful objects, real rockets, real satellites, landers, probes, anything that might interest someone who wants to find out what's going on in space and how we get into space. Now today we're going to be focusing on two objects in particular. One is the Black Arrow rocket. It's a real rocket, never launched, but it came to the Science Museum. And the flight spare of the satellite which its predecessor launched. It's called Prospero. Now 50 years ago, on the 28th of October 1971, the Black Arrow R3 rocket launched the Prospero satellite. Now that was a very important launch because it was the one and only time to date that Britain has launched its own spacecraft. Now the origins of Black Arrow lie with another rocket called Black Knight. Black Knight was a research rocket for Britain's ballistic missile programme. So with some modifications, increased power of the engines and a few other amendments, Black Arrow was constructed from the Black Knight rocket design. The Black Arrow rocket used to be displayed on the floor in the Space Gallery, but some years ago we suspended it from the ceiling and we separated the stages so that people can see something of how our rocket works, the way in which it casts off spent, dead stages as it gets faster and faster and higher and higher. If we look at the engine bay of that first stage and we look right in the middle, we can see a small metal ball. Now that ball was gripped by a hydraulic clamp, part of the launching apparatus for Black Arrow, and it held onto the rocket as it built up thrust, and then when the engines had reached maximum thrust, the clamp released the rocket and up it went into the air. Now the speed it has to reach is 1700 meters per second, really fast, which is 3,800 miles per hour. And it's also got to get it to an altitude of 55 kilometers high. The first stage of Black Arrow fired for about 2 minutes, and then it had something called explosive bolts, which detonated, and they separated the first stage from the rest of the rocket. If we look at the second stage of the Black Arrow rocket, we can see some small thrusters. Now they're called siskins, they're named after the bird, and their job was to actually fire and pull the rest of the rocket away from the spent first stage. This was to avoid any collisions in space. The third stage of the Black Arrow rocket comprised the satellite and a third little engine or motor, rocket motor, called Waxwing, again named after the bird. And this would be the motor that provided the final acceleration up to orbital speed, orbital velocity. Now before that Waxwing started to fire, the whole third stage arrangement started to be spun at about 3 revolutions per second, and then eventually the satellite was released from Waxwing and both actually were in orbit. What can we say about Black Arrow 50 years on from its launch? Well, it made Britain the 6th nation to launch its own spacecraft. Perhaps more importantly, it started to tell us a lot more with the Prospero satellite about how to make satellites. And ever since then, Britain's satellite industry has gone from strength to strength. So we now launch many satellites, albeit using other nations' rockets. Perhaps in the near future that will all change, as there are plans to launch satellites from Britain itself. So we're fortunate to have two real space objects. Can't see them anywhere else.